request dispatcher, and send redirect method. In this chapter, we will discuss about the various techniques to communicate between the servlets, i.e., inter-servlet communication. Various ways to communicate between the servlets. Here are the few methods. Request dispatching, using HTTP redirect, servlet chaining. Let's see all the methods one by one in detail. Let's start with the request dispatcher. In many situations, we are in need to include the content from an HTML page or the output from another servlet. For these purposes, we can use include and forward methods of the request dispatcher interface, which is defined in the javax.servlet package. As the name implies, the include method is used to include the content from another resource, such as another servlet, a JSP page, or an HTML page. The method's signature will be like this. Next, the forward method is used to forward a request from one servlet to another. Here, before passing the request, original servlet can perform some tasks on the request object. The general form of the forward method is like this. If we want to perform include or forward operation, first we have to obtain a request dispatcher object. We can obtain this object in three ways, like using getRequestDispatcher, using the servlet context, using getRequestDispatcher method, servlet request, or using getNameDispatcher method of the servlet context. Here, in the first two methods, we have to give the relative path as a parameter, but in the third one, we have to specify the name of the resource. If we are creating a request dispatcher from a servlet named first servlet to include or forward the request to another servlet called second servlet, then the codes to forward the request will be like this. Here we are using only the name of the servlet as a parameter, instead of path, because both the servlets are in the same directory. So, there is no need to specify any path. Just / before the name of the servlet is enough. If they are in the different directory, then we have to use the relative path with respect to the request object. By using the servlet context object to obtain the request dispatcher, then we have to specify the path relative to the context, like /servlet /second servlet. The third one is to use the getNameDispatcher method. Here, we use the name of the resource, i.e., the servlet name alone. To use this method, the corresponding resource must have an entry in the deployment descriptor, i.e., web.xml file. Remember that if we are including a servlet from a doPost method, the doPost method of the second servlet will be invoked. Likewise, if we are including from a doGet method, the doGet method of the second servlet will be called. The next technique is using sendRedirect method. As we have seen earlier, the forward method performs the redirection on the server side using original request and response objects. But the sendRedirect method sends the request with the new URL back to the client, and then it connects to the URL by creating a new pair of request and response objects. The sendRedirect is a method in the HTTP servlet response interface, and the code will be like this. As a summary of our discussion, we will see the difference between sendRedirect and forward methods. The sendRedirect method works by sending a status code that tells the browser to request another URL. This clearly shows that there is always a round trip to the client side. In addition to this, the previous HTTP servlet request object is lost. The forward method, on the other hand, redirects the request without the help from the client's browser. Both the HTTP servlet request object and the HTTP servlet response object are passed to the new resource. The sendRedirect method is slower than forward, but it gives us more flexibility because it can redirect the user to any URL, while the forward works within the same web application. Now you have got a clear idea about the request dispatcher and the send redirect. Now let's discuss the remaining techniques in the next lesson. Servlet chaining. Servlet chaining is a process in which the output of the first servlet will be sent as an input to the second servlet, and the output of the second servlet to the third servlet, and so on. Finally, the output from the last servlet is sent back to the browser. Here is the figure which gives the illustration of servlet chaining. Here, the client sends the request which is processed by the servlets 1, 2, and 3, and finally the output of servlet 3 was sent back to the client. Generally, we can use the request dispatcher to achieve the servlet chaining. We can use the attributes of the request object to set and retrieve the values between the servlets. Let us see an example that implements the servlet chaining. In this example, we have two servlets, i.e., first servlet and the second servlet, and a simple HTML form. In the first servlet, we retrieve the name from the request parameter that was sent by the simple form, for example, and set the name in the request object and send the response to the next servlet, where we will get the value and print the value in the browser. Here we are seeing the codes for a simple form.html program. In this, we simply create an HTML form and assign the value of the action attributes is the URL to execute the first servlet. Remember, the name of the input field in the form is name. Here are the codes for the first servlet. I explain the heart of the program alone because all of you know the basic things to create a servlet. First, we retrieve the value of the username by calling the getParameter method using request object and store the value in the string name. We check the value of the name, and if it is not equal to null, it will store the value in the request object using the setAttribute method. Also, it creates a request dispatcher object using the request object by calling the getRequestDispatcher method and dispatching the request and response objects to the second servlet using the forward method. If it is null, it will throw an error message using the sendError method in the response object. Now we are seeing the codes for the second servlet. Here, we simply retrieve the username using the getAttribute method and print the value in the browser. Let's look at the output. Here is the simple form. Now enter our username, for example, Wings. Enter this in the text field and click the Submit button. It will show the message, the username is Wings. We gave the message only in the second servlet, so the request for the form goes to the first servlet and it is forwarded to the second servlet, and finally the second servlet displays the message in the browser. I hope now you got a clear idea about the servlet chaining.